This presentation is being recorded, and we will post it on YouTube when we're done so that you will have this as a resource and you'll be able to share it with other people. Thank you all so much for joining me today. My name is Katie Grzesiak, and I'm the coordinator of the Northwest Michigan Invasive Species Network out of the Grand Traverse Conservation District. I am joined here today by Fields Ratliff, who's our habitat management specialist, and he's going to help me with any questions. So since I have you all muted and your videos turned off, if you have a question, I encourage you to type it into that chat box, and Fields will be watching that chat box and interjecting questions, in between slides when that's appropriate, and saving some questions for the end. So, just feel free to type those questions in at any time. I can handle it. But then there will also be a major question period at the end when I'm happy to answer any other questions that come up. So without further ado, I think we'll get going here. As I said, I coordinate the Northwest Michigan Invasive Species Network, and as you can tell by the name, we are a network of partners. We have over 60 partners. We cover 4 counties in Northwest Lower Michigan: Benzie, Grand Traverse, Leelanau, and Manistee. And we work with partners from federal partners like the Sleeping Bear Dunes, and tribal partners like, we actually have 2 different tribal partners that we work with, all the way down to garden clubs and interested individuals, just people who care about invasive species. And we all work together about invasive species because that's the way to get stuff done. So we just really appreciate this massive amount of knowledge and experience that comes together, as well as communicating needs and education. And it is definitely a cooperative effort. So we really appreciate that. There are groups like ISN, that's what we call ourselves for short because it's a long name, all over the state. Oftentimes they're called CISMAs, Cooperative Invasive Species Management Areas. So if you're calling in from a different part of the state, there may be a CISMA close to you that would have the most local information. The information we're going to share with you today is definitely great information, but it's always great to work with your local organizations as well. So we are funded by almost entirely grants. Traditionally, the Michigan Invasive Species Grant Program has been a huge part of that funding, but because of the COVID-19 epidemic and all of the budgetary strife that brings with it, our grants have been paused. That was about 75% of our funding, so a lot of our programming has been paused or reduced. But we do still have some really fantastic support from the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative through both the Forest Service and tribal partners, and the Good Neighbor Authority, which is a partnership between the Michigan DNR and the U.S. Forest Service. So we're really, really grateful for those funding sources that are still continuing to support us. And in addition, the Grand Traverse Conservation District, which is our home base office and our fiduciary agent, has a millage through Grand Traverse, the county of Grand Traverse. And so that doesn't necessarily support ISN's work, but it does support our home base and allows us to do things like print paper and other things. So it's really, really fantastic. Some of our current programs, we have a really cool program I'll talk a little bit more about later called Go Beyond Beauty, which is a voluntary program because a lot of our invasive species are still sold completely legally in Michigan. There's no law against it, but they're causing a lot of problems. And so we want to recognize those businesses and individuals who are going above and beyond the law to not sell invasive species. We also try to energize the public through work bees, mainly focus on garlic mustard and baby's breath to get people out there, get their hands dirty, and help them connect to habitats. We also do control when grants allow it, and when we have cost share with landowners. We try to control high priority species and high quality habitats, various species, and it will depend on different grantors which species we're able to prioritize, but lots of them. And then we do a lot of outreach presentations like this, as well as presentations I just gave a presentation to a garden club yesterday, and 2 weeks before that, something to the Society of American Foresters. So we're really trying to get out to anybody who's interested in learning more about invasive species, and making sure that we're providing that information, answering questions when people call in, providing resources and just being a resource for everybody who asks for help. So I mentioned a little bit about this, but it's really easy when we're talking about invasive species to get really stuck into the doom and gloom of like, oh, invasive species are bad and everything is terrible and they're awful. But we try to think about the good things. And so we connect with that saying that habitat matters. And habitat matters for humans. I like to go hiking, my fiance likes to go mountain biking, and my brother likes to fish. You know, everybody has something that they like to do outside or even just see outside. You know, my mom loves to watch the birds on the bird feeder outside. And every part of that connection that we have to the outdoors is really important, and it means that our habitats matter to us. There's continuing studies about how important habitat, being outside, is to the humans, both physically and mentally, and so we know that that's really very real. As well, habitat's really important to our wildlife. Habitat is what allows our wildlife to thrive. There's so many really cool connections between the plants and the insects and the animals, and whether you're a bird watcher or an angler or a hunter, there's something in the wildlife that needs a habitat, and it's really important for that. And then in our four-county area, we say that habitat matters for Northwest Michigan as a whole. Thinking about our economy in particular, there is tourism for people who specifically come up here to see our wildflowers or see our dunes or see, you know, any of those really fantastic habitats that we have. In addition, we have wineries and cherry orchards that are deeply dependent on the pollinators and the habitat that keeps the pollinators there in order to produce their products. And then the tourism that brings in, as well as logging and fishing and other industries like that, rely on habitat in order to have those renewable resources. So habitat really, really matters to us in a huge variety of ways. And it is really easy to think about how habitat matters when we think about, in particular, monarch butterflies. Most people know the story of how monarch caterpillars have to eat milkweed when they're little babies so that they can grow up into butterflies. And once they're adults, they can eat just about any flower, like the Joe Pyeweed in this picture. But those monarch butterfly caterpillars are that perfect. It's just the exact sort of story that we think about when we think about those deep habitat connections between insects and plants. And of course, pollinators are something, other pollinators like bees are a hot topic today in the environmental world. And so we think about that a lot as well. But our caterpillars and moths, caterpillars of butterflies and moths are a really fantastic resource when we're thinking about the food web as a whole. Because about 95% of our birds in North America feed their babies insects. They may eat seeds or fruit when they're adults, but when they're babies, they need squishy, squishy insects. And the tastiest kind of squishy, squishy insects are caterpillars. And caterpillars often have a really tight relationship with a kind of plant. So I have a couple of examples here, two different kinds of moths and a butterfly that have a really specific host plant that those caterpillars need. You know, butterflies are really beautiful, and we need caterpillars in order to have butterflies, and we need caterpillar food in order to have caterpillars. And then those caterpillars, of course, can also turn into bird food because that is really, really important too. So that whole food web is a really important part. Native species are the best way to support those insects. And you can see from this table that our native trees in particular support a huge number of butterfly and moth species. This is not including all the bees and ants and beetles that they support, just butterflies and moths. And so something like an oak tree would support over 500 species. Whereas plant species that are non-native, that don't have these deep connections in their habitat may support awesome habitat in their home range, but when even though they've been here in North America for a really long time, support very, very few species. And so they're just not a part of the habitat. There may be a lot of other problems with them as well, which we will discuss today, but that lack of habitat is really key. So now that I've started talking about invasive species, I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page. An invasive species is a non-native species that harms people, the environment, or the economy. So it has to be non-native and it has to cause harm. We focus mostly on plants, and we're going to focus on plants today. But invasive species can, of course, be insects or diseases or fish or mammals even. So it's important to think about that. This invasion curve shows thinking about just if there's not that many plants or whatever invasive species yet, it's a lot easier to control. When there's just that one plant, it's a lot easier to pull it up and be like, I win. Well, that plant is dead. I have to watch. I have to be careful that there aren't more seeds, but what a success. It was very easy. It was very cheap. Whereas if you wait until there's a lot of it, it's very expensive, it's very time consuming, it's very sanity consuming, and you have a lower chance of success as well. And so we're always trying to prioritize to the left side of that curve, doing prevention, and when we detect things for the first time, doing something about it whenever we can. And that is a very common invasive species management tactic. But what we're all here to talk about today is knotweed. So that is finally what I'm going to talk to you about. I want to start with some history. All knotweed has come from a single plant that a gentleman called Philip von Siebold from Germany, who went over to Japan while they were still in isolation, when they really weren't allowing other people in and out. He stole some plants, got kicked out for mapping too much stuff, and brought it back to Europe in the mid 1800s, and all of the knotweed in like the rest of the world is cloned from that one female specimen that he brought. It was really well received in Europe. Like the next year, everyone thought it was the coolest thing ever because it's a really cool and interesting looking plant. It was brought over to the United States, but then we realized pretty quickly that you just can't stop it. Knotweed has a lot of names. And so I've listed a couple of them here. Its name in its native land is Itadori in Japan, but around here you can come up with all sorts of names. And so there's just a lot of it all around. So Japanese knotweed is the name that most of us call our invasive knotweeds. We actually have a couple of species, but most often you'll hear people talk about Japanese knotweed. It's pretty tall. Usually, I think that 6 to 10 feet is honestly a little high. Usually true Japanese knotweed isn't quite so tall. And it can spread clonally, so it'll just keep getting wider and wider. It has bamboo-like stems with big spade-shaped leaves. Those stems are hollow. I'm going to show you a lot more pictures, don't worry. And it has sprays of white flowers, although they can be pink in some situations. And it has just an incredible root system that goes down 3 meters or 9 feet. So it's really difficult to dig out. There's a lot of biomass, a lot of stuff, growing stuff there. And it also just goes down really deep. And this is because it is from the volcanic regions of Japan. And so there would be a lava flow that would come over this plant and burn it back, but those roots and rhizomes that were down 9 feet into the ground wouldn't get burned up, and it would be able to bust right back through. Japanese knotweed is not the only knotweed we deal with, though. And that is because there was also giant knotweed that was brought over. It is bigger than the Japanese knotweed. You can see the comparison of the leaves there, but it easily grows 6 to 10 feet and beyond, 15 feet for sure. Its leaves are more heart-shaped. They're much larger. And these two species can hybridize. Because there was only female plants brought of Japanese knotweed, it wouldn't be able to sexually reproduce, but because there is also giant knotweed that does have male plants, those are able to hybridize and make the Bohemian knotweed, which is the third species here. And that's what most of our invasive knotweed is in Northwest Michigan. It is this hybrid. It is able to do sexual reproduction where it makes seeds, as well as reproducing by fragments and all over, in all sorts of other ways. But what's important actually is not necessarily knowing what you have, because we get to treat them all the same. They're all bad, at least in this context. Obviously, they're really cool in their native habitats, but they're all causing the same problems. They're all invasive species in North America. They are all treated the same way. So you don't necessarily need to know which one you have. It's always useful. It's good to have that data for science. But for the nitty-gritty on the ground, you don't need to know which one you have. So I've got some pictures here. Here is some of our Bohemian knotweed, that hybrid knotweed. And you can see it's a bit taller than our friend here. And that's not uncommon. That's, I would say, a pretty average height stand. It can be shorter, it can be taller, but that's pretty average. And you can see how thick it is, and just what a big plant. This picture on the left, oh, I can turn on my laser pointer here. This picture on the left, you can see this is a true Japanese knotweed. It has a very flat leaf base and a pretty round leaf. It has these sprays of white flowers. That is true Japanese knotweed. Here's this one's probably hybrid knotweed, but this is another knotweed. When it is young, it looks kind of like a really, really big asparagus coming out of the ground. And this is where we start to see problems, and I'll show you some more pictures of problems later. But because it's able to form this point, it's able to really bust through stuff and cause some havoc. A great time to identify knotweeds is during the wintertime, actually, in fall and even early spring, because even though the plant dies all the way back, you get these canes that stand. They're hollow, they're dry, they're dead, they're not like part of the plant anymore, but they're pretty visible. A lot of times they're kind of reddish colored, and so you could really spot them from far away and walk up to them and know what they are. Some of the lookalikes that we'll talk about later do have canes like this, but they're not usually so strong. They're usually a little more mushy. So those canes are a really good way. You can really see the kind of bamboo-like structure here with those joints and the arching form. Here I have some pictures. This green stem is this year's growth. And then these reddish, brownish stems are actually the dead stems from last year. So you can see both growing together. This is some of that hybrid Bohemian knotweed. And you can see some of it has pretty heart-shaped leaves. Some of it has a little flatter leaf base. Again, it's not super important to know that. I just wanted to show you. But that is what we have there. Here's a close-up of the stem. You can see it's really jointed. Each one of these joints is a part of the stem that's solid, but then all in between here is hollow. So that's where that bamboo kind of moniker comes from, but with those big leaves, you know it's something different. And here you can see there's that hollow in the stem, and it's a little bit of a juicy plant, but it is very remarkably hollow. You will not miss how hollow this plant is. It is not a tree. And then I mentioned before the pink fleece cultivar. This tends to be a little shorter, and you can see it has these little pink flowers. And so because it doesn't get as tall, folks don't often get as alarmed by it, but it is definitely still, this is a Japanese knotweed. It is still a big problem. It still has those roots. We'll talk more about the problems in a little bit. Sorry, I keep teasing you with that. So knotweed lookalikes, pokeweed is our most common lookalike. It has those similar kind of reddish stems and big leaves. The plant dies back every year, but it has a whole bunch of fruit. So it does have these stems, but you can see it doesn't have those joints at every leaf the way Japanese knotweed and all of the other knotweeds do. And then these stems, they're kind of weak by the end of the winter. They're flopping over a lot. They're not so stiff. And it is covered in a profusion of dark berries, as opposed to the knotweeds, which if they have fruits, will just have a few and they'll be these little papery guys. You will not, if there are fruits on it, it is a pokeweed. Pokeweed is native. It can definitely be aggressive. It can definitely be weedy. You don't have to like pokeweed, but it's not a situation where you need to be worried about the environment. One note though, all parts of the plant are toxic. So to humans at least. Birds love them, but if you have little kids, you don't want them to eat pokeweed. Some other lookalikes, bamboo, you can see there's that joint that we're all familiar with bamboo, but you can see that bamboo leaves are much, much slimmer. It is also invasive in other areas of the US, and it's kind of a watch list species for us. We're keeping an eye on it. It doesn't seem to do too well in Michigan because it dies over the winter, but with a changing climate, yeah, never know. So, knotweed problems. I've been teasing you with this for a little while, but it is very, very fast growing. It can block visibility. It can clog wetlands. It can make it difficult to move through stuff. But that on its own doesn't really make it a problem. It also is very strong, as you can see in this photo. It's able to buckle pavement and all sorts of other structures. I talked with a gentleman once who didn't know, and he parked his boat trailer over a knotweed patch in the fall, and then in the spring, that little asparagus tip came through and punctured his boat tire, or the tires on the trailer. And then he was faced with the trouble of trying to get that trailer out of the knotweed patch with also no air in the tires and an inability to get to it. So it was really difficult. It's also very hardy. It doesn't mind fire, and it is able to grow from fragments. I have some more pictures showing up later. Not only can it grow sideways from its roots and rhizomes, but it can also, every little piece of the plant, or very nearly, can allow a new plant to grow. Usually it doesn't spread by seeds, but since we do mostly have that Bohemian knotweed, it is able to spread by seeds. It seems like most of the spread we see is still from fragmentation, but it is definitely possible for it to spread by seed. So here is an example of blocking river passage. And unfortunately, these folks who were working on this wood duck box, I don't think that they were aware of what they were cutting down, but all of this is Japanese or Bohemian knotweed. And you can see that it would be very difficult for wildlife to get places, and all of those cut stems are definitely going to come back. Nothing is going to die. And so just a really, really frustrating situation. I'm trying to show you here some of the root mass. There's a lot of it, and it goes down really far. This is from a colleague of mine, Tom Clements, who decided he had some in his backyard, and he was like, you know what, I'm going to be really careful and try and dig this up. And he never found the end of it, and it came back the next year. And you can see it goes down quite deep, and he's able to come right back from a spoil pile, anything like that. And then you can see the tiniest fragment, if it has a node, which is that part where the leaf is, then it can start a new plant. And so you can see that this is really, really, really tiny. And the problem is that every stem has a bunch of those. So each one of these purple circles represents a node. And so if you were to mow this or chop it up, or even just you know, pull off a stem and drop it somewhere, each one of those nodes could start a new plant. And so we really want to avoid that. And then there are nodes like that all over in the roots and rhizomes as well. So again, if you're digging, you're just stirring that all up and really encouraging it to sprout. It is a disturbance-based plant, which is super cool, but also a problem. Some more yucky pictures. You can see it will grow through cracks in existing. It'll bang right through brand new asphalt. It'll grow up through your soffits. And this one's in Manistee, Michigan, actually. They had some growing on the side of their house, and then it started coming in through their basement. And then in the UK, they've had it for even longer than us. And so in England, they've actually had trouble getting insurance on their houses because they know what it does. So if you have knotweed, you're like, you've got to get rid of it because you can't even insure your house if you have it there. So it's definitely, they've had it longer, and they have a smaller space for it to be in. So they're dealing with a lot of those repercussions, but we are a little earlier in the process and have some chances. It's not uncommon for knotweed to spread along roadsides by mowing. So that's something we work with road commissions about, is to not mow those areas that have knotweed so that it doesn't keep going, because it can be a problem for the road, both by visibility and for the physical structure of the road. And so here's an example of, oh, here's the original patch. It was this cute little patch that was under a tree, and they had some flowers planted nearby, but then it spread along the utility lines, and it's just a really big problem, and now it's all over the place. So I mentioned earlier that there are a lot of invasive species that are not illegal to move in Michigan, but here in Michigan, knotweed is one of the few species that we do have a law about. So all of these plants, so Japanese knotweed, Bohemian knotweed, and giant knotweed, are illegal to sell, trade, move, or share, including those hybrids, including fragments or seeds or any other little pieces. It's not illegal to have this. So if you've already got it on the yard, no one's going to show up and knock on your door and say, hey, I heard that you are the naughtiest and you have this plant and you're going to jail. Like that's not going to happen. But if you're spreading it, if you're sharing it, if you're digging up fill to put in a patio and you dump that fill in your neighbor's yard, that's illegal. Please don't spread this plant. We really don't need any more of it. And so do watch out for that. The other thing about knotweed is that commitment is really important. This is not a plant that you can start treating and then be like, whew, that was work. I am never doing that again. Because at that point, you've just aggravated it. You've activated all those nodes and made them all turn into new plants. So no matter where you are or how big your population is, knotweed control will take a minimum of 2 years. You're going to have to treat it for 1 year and probably a second year as well. It is not uncommon for it to take much longer than that, especially for some of these stands that have been there for like 100 years. They have a lot of biomass, a lot of plant material to grow from, and it takes a long time to kill it. Physical removal, we don't recommend, and you can probably guess why, and we'll talk more about that in a moment, but it's definitely going to require more than 10 years. But even chemical control isn't terribly fast. And every control effort, even if you kill it in 2 years, you need to continue to monitor it after that. So just checking, did it come back? I think I got it all, but am I really, really sure? And again, if you treat it once and then stop, or treat it for 3 years and then stop, but there's still some coming up, it is not unlikely that you will get more. It especially likes to spread sideways. Ooh, this spot isn't very good. Well, I'll just move over a little bit and come up. So using the best management practices and continuing the work is the best way to get going on it. So mechanical treatment is not recommended. Again, when we're thinking about digging down 9 feet and getting out all of those little itty bitty pieces that are smaller than your fingernail, it's just really difficult. The UK does have some efforts where they dig out all the soil and sieve it all out and pull out all of the plant matter. But I don't know of any businesses in the United States doing that. And it would probably be pretty prohibitively expensive. I have heard about some success about folks cutting it, not mowing, not splitting it everywhere and spreading it all over the place, but going through and cutting it once or twice a week, because remember, this is a very fast growing plant, for a long time. You can eventually exhaust that plant. But when you have all those tops, remember that you have to put those tops somewhere. You can, once they're dry, like those canes that overwinter, those aren't real knotweed anymore. They can't grow. But until they're all dried out, they do have a risk of spread. You can't move them off site. And if it's still alive and touching the soil, it could absolutely grow. Compost isn't going to get hot enough. Remember, volcanoes don't kill this stuff. So compost is not going to be okay. You do have to dry those stems. Then you can burn them if you want, or once they're dry, they're just like straw. It's not a big deal. But until they're dry, you really have to watch out for them. So we don't recommend mechanical. It can be done, but we just don't recommend it. What we do the most is called a foliar spot spray of herbicides. This is what we recommend for the most. It is targeted. It allows you to focus on only the plant and try your hardest not to hit anything else. And there are a variety of herbicides that work. They all have their different pluses and minuses. So Milestone is very effective and it has multiple treatment windows, but it is not approved for aquatic use. So you can't use it next to a river or a lake. And it can kill trees nearby. So it is only appropriate in certain situations. Clearcast has a little bit fewer restrictions, but it can only be treated in a very specific treatment window. And there's a really specific formula with 5% Clearcast, 1 to 2% methylated seed oil, and then a little bit of glyphosate as well. So it's quite a cocktail there. That is aquatic approved. You are able to do that as long as you have an aquatic approved methylated seed oil. There are not many of those. So it's just like a little bit more complicated, but it is absolutely also a high efficacy. And then Imazapyr or Habitat, works pretty well, but it has just as many, if not more, tree sensitivity issues as Milestone, and all of the timing restrictions of Clearcast. So we don't use it. We knew some other partners who do. It's a very effective herbicide, but we just don't use it. For a foliar spray, vinegar and glyphosate are not effective. Vinegar will just burn the leaves and let it come right back, and glyphosate seems to work too quickly on its own, and not really get down into the roots. Both of the herbicides that we use, actually all three of those, Milestone, Clearcast, and Habitat, are all systemic herbicides. So they're going to go in, they don't kill the plant too quickly because they're going in to get down to the roots to try to kill more of that biomass, kill those roots and rhizomes so that you have less of it. Still going to take some time, but that is the whole point of them. Glyphosate is a systemic herbicide, but it works too quickly. So next up, I have a video. There's no sound on the video, but it hopefully will be useful. And this is us using a backpack sprayer to spray Japanese knotweed. So that was our sprayer, and it was on some secondary containment to keep any spills from happening. And then you can see we have this beautiful knotweed patch. And the thing that we talk about with spraying is that you're just spraying to wet. You're not trying to get the herbicide to drip off, because anything that drips off has been wasted. So you want to cover as much of the plant as possible while not letting any herbicide drip off the plant. And so that is what this video shows. And you can see that there's a blue dye in the herbicide, and that's so we can tell what we have and haven't already treated. And we recommend using that dye as well as a surfactant, which is an additive to help make the herbicide stick to the plant. So you can see you just don't have to spray that much. More is not more. More is a waste of money and more harmful to the ecosystem. There's no point in using extra herbicide here. But you don't have to have a backpack sprayer. You can also use a spray bottle. So we have a little video of that as well. And you can see it's about the same amount there. If you don't have a lot of the knotweed, this is a really good option that you can get a spray bottle from Home Depot for a couple of bucks, or Lowe's or any Ace Hardware, any kind of hardware store that has chemical resistant spray bottles that will work. But the risks with a foliar spray of any kind is that you can have what's called drift. And that is where a little bit of that herbicide gets on something else. It can either be drift or just off-target spray. You were aiming at the knotweed, but you accidentally hit the roses nearby. You can try to mitigate that with just like a piece of cardboard to be a shield. But if you're in a really sensitive situation, there is an option for cut stem, cut and fill, or an injection. And this is a really good one for DIY and for really sensitive situations, because it is a very measured amount of herbicide so that you're not using too much. And there's virtually no risk of off target hitting because you're injecting it into the stems. It is very time consuming. And if you're doing cut stem, and I'll show you videos of both of these, you do have the same issues of what do you do with the tops that can turn into more knotweed. Many herbicides work for this, including, of course, the Milestone, the Clearcast, the Habitat. It does appear that glyphosate will work for this, particularly with injections. I've also had people mention that horticultural vinegar can work for this. I haven't seen any studies on this, and we really caution people from using home remedies. Vinegar it absolutely does kill plants, but it also can cause some problems in the soil. And we find that people tend to be less careful with vinegar because they're familiar with it, whereas they might be more careful with a traditional herbicide. And there are more efficacy and safety studies done on traditional herbicides. So just bear that in mind, that no matter what you're using, if you're using it to kill plants, that makes it an herbicide, and you should treat it with extreme care. Because vinegar, as a fun fact, if I was to chug glyphosate, the active ingredient in Roundup, and Fields was to chug vinegar, he would die of poisoning from the vinegar before I would die of poisoning from the glyphosate. We would both die at some point. They are both not good to chug. Do not do that. But vinegar is more acutely toxic. So just bear that in mind whenever you're thinking about home remedies. So here we have a video of the injection. You can see we have this super cool injector, and it delivers a metered dose, and we're able to say exactly how much to put in. And you stab it into the cane, and it actually needs to either go all the way through like that, or you do 2 holes, because otherwise it's pressurized inside that chamber and the herbicide will squirt back out at you. The great thing about this is, as you can see, there's very, very low risk to the applicator, very, very low risk to the environment. You know, you're just getting the herbicide right in that cane and nowhere else. The problem is you have to mark that cane so that you know you already treated it. It's pretty time consuming and it can be difficult. And if you have these little bitty canes, it's really hard to inject into it, and you do have to inject every single cane for it to be effective. So it does come with some caveats, but it is a really great tool to have. And then the cut and fill, we're going to demonstrate for you here, and you can see just some normal clippers are just fine. The knotweed is not that strong. And so about 2 joints above the ground, you can cut it off. You can see there's this nice big chamber there. And then we have a syringe without a needle. And you just need a couple of milliliters in each chamber. But again, you do have to cut down all the plants. You do have to then figure out what to do with those plants once you've cut them. But it can be very, very effective. We don't use this much because it is so time consuming, and we're trying to be effective with our grant money. But it is a great option for landowners who are able to be at their own home more often and spend that time on it. And again, it's something where the risk to both the handler and the environment is very low because you're not getting it everywhere. So it's a really great option. As a reminder, herbicide labels are legal documents, and you should always read and follow them. They can be absolutely full of of just jargon. And so folks like us here at ISN are here to help you navigate that. But just as a general guideline, ask for help. Where we're all familiar with PPE now with our masks and stuff, but wear your PPE. The label will tell you about what PPE you need, but generally speaking, ISN always wears all of these things whenever we're working with herbicide. It's easy to get complacent and think, oh, this isn't that bad, I've been using it for that long. But it is really important to wash yourself up when you're finished, and not eat with your hands afterwards, all those kinds of things, just to protect yourself. And keep the labels with the chemicals, label your containers, and follow the label. Just to keep yourself safe and keep everybody else safe as well. Many, many risks from pesticides can be mitigated just by wearing proper PPE and following proper decontamination. So please do that. And if you have any questions, let us know. Speaking of decontamination, there's 2 different kinds. There's pesticide decontamination, but there's also invasive species decontamination. And particularly with these invasive knotweeds, it's really important to do this decontamination so you're not taking pieces to the next place that you go for a hike or for a walk or on a barbecue or what have you. And luckily, decontamination is pretty easy. It can be as simple as just making sure you don't have dirt in your shoes. Stomping them out really good. We keep boot brushes. Oh, I don't even think I have one on my desk right now. We keep boot brushes, which are actually horse hoof picks that have a metal hook on one side and a stiff brush on the other that can really help clean out the cleats of your shoes and brush off any seeds, no matter where you are, no matter what you're doing. Invasive species, we want to play clean and go, or work clean, go. So you want to remove that plant material, remove any dirt, remove any seeds, and just leave that where it was from rather than taking it on to the next site. As you're out in the world, and if you're seeing invasive species, we encourage you to report them. This is how we as invasive species managers can make good scientific decisions, is by having as much data as possible. And so here in Michigan, we use the Midwest Invasive Species Information Network, which has an app with tons of pictures. You can also look up and see, is this species, has it been reported near me? And the cool thing is that you can sign up to get updates. So I get an email every time anyone in my 4 counties reports an invasive species. So if you come here on vacation and you report an invasive species, I get a notification about it, and I can make decisions better that way. And if you're curious about what's happening in your area, you can get those notifications too. It doesn't tell you who did it, your privacy is protected, but you can see what is where. I mean, it's really useful, and it can help you figure out what you have. On their website, you don't have to have a smartphone to do this. You can report on their website, and on their website they have training tutorials as well. So if you really enjoyed learning about knotweeds today, but you want to learn about honeysuckles or baby's breath or purple loosestrife tomorrow, they've got training modules that you can go through and learn more about those species. So it's a really valuable resource. I promised to tell you more about Go Beyond Beauty, and this is that program working to celebrate those folks who are going above and beyond the law and not using or selling high priority invasive species in their garden to be used in gardens. We do also love to celebrate the folks who are selling native plants, but the main goal is to stop the sales of invasive species voluntarily. So we have lots and lots of landscapers that work with us, and you can see that many of them have some extra certifications working on shorelines, or just being a certified green industry professional through the Michigan Nursery and Landscaper Association. This list is not complete, unfortunately, with our grant pauses. The folks who normally make really gorgeous graphics for us had to be laid off. And so this is a lower priority, unfortunately, but you can go to our website, habitatmatters.org, to see everybody in our 4 counties who is participating. And then we also have many nurseries, and again, this is not a complete list. I think that there's at least 2 that are not on this list, of nurseries who've said, yeah, we're not even going to carry some of these high priority invasive species, and so you can shop there and know that you are safe from those high priority species, which is really, really exciting, and we just can't thank them enough for that business decision. You know, they may be cutting into their bottom line by doing that. We get a lot of questions about what to do next. Even though knotweed is a long process, people want to know what can I plant instead, or I've done it, I've killed it all, now what? And we have some great resources about that, but I just wanted to go over some of that with you. We love planting native plants from seed, or any plants from seeds, but oftentimes we don't recommend it for this kind of a restoration project. Mainly because it can be difficult to tell what it is that's coming up, or some of the herbicides have a pre-emergent herbicide in there that might stop some of those seeds. So we recommend using plugs or adult plants, or bare root seedlings. So I have just a couple of plants that I was going to share with you. We have a much longer list that we'd be happy to share as well, but just today. Quaking aspen is a really good one if you were appreciating Japanese knotweed for its windbreak ability, or for the fact that it is able to spread clonally. This is a tree that can definitely spread clonally. It grows very, very quickly. It can take wet, it can take dry. It has this really attractive pale bark and gorgeous gold leaves in the fall, and it is pretty green the rest of the year. And just as an FYI, the Grand Traverse Conservation District and probably all of your local conservation districts sell seedlings in the spring, and some conservation districts sell in the fall as well. And that's a great way to get a lot of young plants for a very cheap price. If you want something that's bigger right away, you definitely would want to visit a local nursery or garden center. But just as an FYI, that's a great resource for you. Red osier dogwood is another one that's a really nice replacement. It doesn't get as tall. It's not a tree, it's a shrub. And so it has kind of that same height range as the invasive knotweeds. It has the same kind of winter interest with these bright red stems in the middle of winter. It's really interesting to look at. You can still get some privacy from that hedge, but it's not going to be as tall as a tree. And it's a little bit less aggressive of a spreader than the aspens. And again, this is something that you can often, it's very commonly sold commercially. You can definitely find red osier dogwood or red twig dogwood at a local garden center. But if you're looking for a lot of it on the cheap, those seedling sales are a great option. And this is, again, it can take a lot of different soil types, but it's really good at handling wet areas. Eastern white cedar is a tree that we see planted a lot as hedges. And it's great for that, but it's also the kind of cons there is that deer will eat it up. And it is also one of the trees that is sensitive to milestone. So if you were treating with milestone, this would not be the tree for you, but it is really, really beautiful. It can form a great hedge. It's very, it's just a really nice tree or shrub, depending on how you grow it. But just as an FYI, there are some kind of cons to it, and I wanted to make sure to share those with you. But it doesn't have to be a tree or a shrub. There are lots of perennials that are fantastic. I'm only sharing with you native plants today because we just love to promote native plants. There are lots of non-natives, but switchgrass is a great one that's available through many nurseries. There are lots of cultivars of this, as well as wild types of it. It's nice because it forms a little bunch. As you can see from this picture down here, it kind of stays in its little bunches. It's not going to spread out and go crazy like some grasses. It still gets pretty tall. It'll stand through the winter. It feeds birds with its seeds. It's just really lovely, but then it dies back every year. It doesn't keep getting taller the way a tree does. So that's really fantastic. There are lots and lots of other fantastic perennials and grasses that you can explore, but that's just a couple. Some additional resources, and I will be emailing these out to everybody who registered for this webinar. But if you visit habitatmatters.org and go under resources and additional resources, we have honestly scads of resources, including some of the knotweed replacement ideas and some notes about what may or may not be a good idea about that. Places to purchase herbicide in our 4 counties. And if you're not feeling comfortable, because like, honestly, this is a little bit technical, right? Landowners can totally do this, but it can feel pretty daunting. And so we also have a list of herbicide applicators in our 4 counties, as well as a couple of others that we know of that do invasive species work. And we've tried to put some stars. We can't recommend anyone since we're, you know, kind of a pseudo government agent, well, definitely a government body of government, but so we can't recommend people, but what we've done is put stars by the folks who have gone through a training with us or that we know do invasive species work. And so hopefully those are all good resources. There's lots more on there. The state of Michigan website on invasive species, michigan.gov/invasives, is a great wealth of knowledge, both about knotweed and the best management practices about that, and lots of other invasive species. And then if you're, you know, heard me talking about SISMAs earlier and you're interested in that, the Michigan Invasive Species Coalition, which their website is michiganinvasives.org, has a lot of fantastic information about getting into your local SISMA and finding them. And then the last one, this website is going live after the 4th of July, so I forgot to put it on here. It isn't there yet. But the Midwest Invasive Plant Network, or MIPN, which is MIPN.org, has some really fantastic resources, particularly about choosing not to use invasive species in your gardens and some of the alternatives there. So those are coming up. You know, again, I said after the 4th of July, but a really great resource. So now I would love to field some questions from you.
Maybe if you want to read the first one.
Oh, okay. I can read that. Hold on, let me pull up the chat because it looks like it's difficult for fields to just read them to me. Okay, so there are some anecdotal stories about Jerusalem artichokes or sunchokes crowding out or suppressing knotweed growth. On our property, we have some Jerusalem artichoke, and there does seem to be something to this. The knotweed is not encroaching into the patch. Have you heard of anything like that? As far as I know, Jerusalem artichoke is native. Yes, I know Jerusalem artichoke is native to North America. I would have to double check on whether it was native to Michigan, but at the very least, it doesn't ring any alarm bells. I have not heard about that suppressing knotweed growth, and I will have to do some research into that because that is really exciting. That's one of the things that we love to hear about, is when even anecdotal research, or not research, stories about suppressing, that can be really exciting to hear about. So I will look into that, see what I can find out. If I find anything really quickly, I'll send that out in the email to you all. But as things go by, we'll certainly, if we learn more, we will absolutely incorporate that into our materials. So thank you so much for bringing that up. Are there any other questions? Oh, best resource in Kalamazoo for treatment. Unfortunately, I don't have all the specifics for the Kalamazoo area, but I would really recommend you contact your local SISMA, which for Kalamazoo would be the BCK SISMA. And let me find their contact information for you. If you go onto that Michigan invasive species, oh, of course, it's Fallon. And so many of our SISMAs have been struck by this funding problem, and BCK is one of them, but their coordinator is still working for one of the conservation districts. So she's still around and doing some really excellent work. And her name is Fallon Januska, and you can contact her directly. But yeah, BCK SISMA. Thank you, Fields, for that link. I think that is perfect. Someone has neighbors who love the knotweed, and yeah, oh gosh, how do you maintain non-proliferation in your own yard? This is a really tricky question, and we deal with this when we're doing treatments for private landowners. If it's a population that's right on the edge of the two properties and their neighbor won't agree, we're not able to do it because you just can't make much headway. I would still encourage you to try to keep it down as much as possible. I think that the cut stem or the injection would be really good. If you're in our area, we do let you rent out those injectors, so you don't have to buy that expensive equipment. We can't sell you herbicide, but we can assist with that. That would probably be a good one because you're just trying to get that edge, just trying to keep that edge, and like, oops, if a little bit extra dies, that's okay. But it's just really difficult, and I'm sorry. I would say sharing the information about what a problem it is, particularly when you're thinking about structures, is always a good option. You can also share, I realized I forgot to mention this during the presentation, but knotweed can put out chemicals in the soil that stop other plants from growing. A lot of times when we do herbicide treatments on knotweed and then there's a dead circle, people are like, wow, you killed all the plants there. And it's like, oh, actually there weren't any other plants there. They were all already dead. And so sharing that might be useful. A lot of times it's just figuring out like what's important to that person. Do they like to watch the birds? Do they like their other flowers? Do they like their home value? You know, what's exciting for them, and try to connect with them over that. But I know that can be really, really tricky, and I'm sorry. Someone asked about placing a tarp over the stubs after they're cut. It wouldn't hurt, but the problem is that when the knotweed comes back up, it has a point and it's going to be able to punch through that tarp. Again, it's not going to hurt. It's going to make that knotweed have to use more energy to get through. But it's not going to necessarily speed things up that much. But again, certainly an option. It's not going to hurt. Someone asked about Japanese knotweed edibility, cutting it in the spring and eating it as a substitute for rhubarb. Japanese knotweed is a tricky plant as far as edibility goes. If you prepare it properly, you can, it is edible. However, it also contains toxins that can be not great, and particularly causing some gastric distress. And so we don't recommend it, but if you look online, there are ways to eat it that aren't, you can safely consume it, but we don't recommend it. And then the other thing that we just don't recommend is if you're harvesting, you don't know whether or not herbicides have been used on that knotweed. And so unless you do know if it's your own property, but yes. So it is edible, but it's complicated. Roundup seems to shrivel the plant, and I said it was too quick. Can I explain this more? Yes. So, I mean, yes and no. I'm not exactly sure on all of the points. Roundup absolutely does shrivel the plants, but it seems to be, it is our experience, and it is the experience of many managers, that it kills the top of the plant, but it doesn't go down into the roots to kill more. And so it isn't depleting as much of the resources that the plant has. And so that's why we don't recommend Roundup as a foliar spray, because when it is taken into the plant to kill the plant, it kills the tissues that it is touching immediately. rather than going in finding more tissues to kill, because it kills too quickly, and so it doesn't get down to the roots. I hope that is a little bit clearer. If it's not, please say something and I can keep trying. But also it probably gets into some plant physiology stuff that are a bit beyond even me. So that's why you're looking for an herbicide that would take maybe 24 hours to a week to really kick in and start seeing death of the plant, because you want that herbicide to be working its way down into the plant. For foliar spraying, is the goal to get on as many leaves as possible on all the stalks, or just some of the leaves on all the stalks? Good question. Generally speaking, as many as the leaves as possible, but you also want to be keeping yourself safe and not walking through a bunch of herbicide. And so, as you noticed in the video, when we were treating the plant when it was younger, which is something that we're able to do with Milestone, because we can treat in June. We can treat earlier and not have to walk through head tall plants. And so if you were going to treat knotweed, I might recommend safely climbing a ladder to be able to spray high, if it is high already. And then just spraying those leaves on the outside. You don't need to worry about getting every single leaf. Also, some advice that you should spray after flowering in the fall so the herbicide gets sucked into the plant. So that is precisely the method that we use for clearcast. That herbicide, it is important to have it in a specific time window. It's not quite fall. For us here in the northern lower peninsula, it usually ends up being mid to late August and into September. After having some unluck with using clearcast, we worked with the manufacturer and found out that it needs about 60 days before frost. And so you don't want it to be too close to fall, because you need to give it all that time to get down into the roots, to get sucked into the plants. But generally speaking, for a lot of plants, it is really great, because these plants are pulling nutrients down into their roots to weather the winter. And so if they're accidentally pulling herbicide down at the same time, that's really fantastic. Why can't you cut it at ground level? What is the benefit of leaving that bit above ground? So if you're doing a cut stem where you're putting the herbicide into that cut stem, you need to leave that stem a little bit taller so that there's room to put the herbicide, honestly. You just want to have that joint there to put herbicide into. If you are doing, for example, a mechanical treatment and you're willing to put in the time to be there for many years, absolutely cut it right down to ground level. There is no point in leaving things that are going to whack you in the shins. So it doesn't need to be terribly tall. And even when we're doing that cut and fill method, we aren't leaving it terribly tall. We're leaving it just a couple of inches tall. So it's not, hopefully even the grass would grow that tall around it, so that you don't see it too much. Great questions. Any other questions for today? Oh, what about putting Roundup down the cut dried stalk? No, the dried stalk is no good, unfortunately, because that part of the plant is dead. You can definitely do it when it's a fresh cut stem. That's quite effective. But if it's dead, it's not going to absorb the nutrients, or the opposite of nutrients, the toxins, excuse me. Which product is best for cut and fill? Is it the same as is good for injection? Yes. Generally speaking, many of those herbicides are very effective at cut and fill. The nice thing about that method is that you can really use a lot of different herbicides, and it is very useful. Here, I can go back to that slide so you can look at them. And again, this will be recorded and put online, so you can refer back to it. Maybe one more. There we go. So Milestone and Clearcast are what we usually use, just because we already have them. But if you're using a glyphosate, especially for those injections in the cut stem, it can be really effective. We've seen that through some of our partners, and it is definitely an option there. So for that, it's very much looking at your site and seeing what herbicide would be appropriate, looking at your goals, management goals. There's never one that's the best. It's always, there's never one that's the best for everything. You're always wanting to look at your site, look at your management goals, and choose the right herbicide. And so again, contacting us or your local SISMA to help you make that decision. That's what we're here for, is to help you with that. Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you all so much. I'm so sorry, usually we're able to get out in the field, so you're not just watching these videos. We really enjoy taking you out in the field, but I hope this is a great way for folks who maybe couldn't make it out to field with us other times to join us. Again, if you have any questions, please feel free to shoot me an email. This will be posted, and I will be following up with another email that will include the link to the recording, as well as some of these other resources that we talked about today. And again, if you have any questions, feel free always to reach out and ask.